The New Babylon, Chapter 6. Pastor Isaac Rubens sat in the thick leather office chair that was in the study in his home. He looked out the window into the neighborhood that he had grown up in. How did we get here? He thought to himself. Except for his time in Bible college and a brief time working as a youth pastor at a church in Michigan, Isaac Rubens had always lived here, in this neighborhood. He glanced up at the window in Tony DeSilva's apartment, the same window that he had seen Tony watching him from as he walked home last night. It was empty now, the curtains drawn closed. Isaac and Tony had been friends in their youth. In high school, both men felt the pull of the life that Tony ended up pursuing. All the boys in their class glorified that lifestyle, and the men who lived it. Fancy cars, plenty of money, and freedom. The freedom to come and go as they pleased. The freedom to do what they wanted when they wanted to do it. In the ignorance of their youth, they longed for that life, which they thought would bring them instant respect. They wanted to be somebody. To them, that lifestyle was the best and fastest way to achieve those things. For many of them, it was the only way. Isaac learned a hard and valuable lesson early on. One night, when he was faced with the man he would need to become to live in that world successfully, it scared him. It scared him deep down in his soul. In the months that followed, he disconnected from his friends, from Tony and the others who would follow Tony into that life. The day after they all graduated from high school, Isaac Rubens stuffed his belongings into a duffel bag and bought a train ticket to the Midwest. He went to live for the summer with his aunt and uncle in Wisconsin. In September, he was enrolled at Maranatha Baptist University. After graduation, he got a position as youth pastor at a small Baptist church in Michigan, where he served for several years. When he got the call to candidate for the senior pastor position at Harvest Fields Baptist Church in his old neighborhood, he flew into New York to begin the process. He was voted in unanimously 2 months later, and has been serving here ever since. Tony DeSilva never moved away from the Queens neighborhood that both men grew up in. As the years went by, Tony moved his way up the ranks in the criminal organization that he was now the leader of. Or, at least he was the leader, before the financial collapse. When the banking system failed, and the city followed in that failure, Tony DeSilva and his organization failed too. All their money, all their power, and all their influence could not sustain them during these times. Tony and his closest associates were hanging on and surviving for now, but they could not sustain themselves indefinitely. They too had limited resources, and at some point would have to find another way. Although Tony had considered the possibility, he recoiled at the thought of having to ask Isaac Rubens for help, of having to ask the church for help. After the death of his mother, Concetta, Tony made it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with the church or with Isaac Rubens. Pastor Rubens was sitting in his office in the rear of the church discussing a few routine matters with Kevin when John Allen came rushing in. "Gentlemen, we have a potential problem," he exclaimed. "A perimeter alarm just went off on the fire escape at the south end of the warehouse." Kevin grabbed his radio and went to work. "Team leader to Overwatch 1, copy?" The response came back almost immediately. "Overwatch 1, copy team leader." Kevin looked over at John Allen and signaled him to get the drone airborne by making a swirling motion in the air with his finger as he spoke into the radio. Jacob, can you see any activity in Garden 2? Jacob answered, No, all quiet. Oh, wait a second, Chief. Jacob picked up the binoculars and squinted into them. Chief, I got one unknown male exiting the fire escape onto the roof. He's headed for the greenhouse. Kevin responded. Okay, drone's on the way. Stay alert and report back immediately if anybody else joins them. I'll have backup there in 2 minutes. Roger that, Chief. Kevin turned, grabbed his rifle, and headed for the door. John Allen was on the gym roof preparing the drone for takeoff. There were 3 old warehouse buildings at the end of the block. They were all long abandoned, years before the collapse. Several members of the church group, joined by half a dozen neighbors, took over the warehouses after the collapse and started growing gardens on the roofs. Warehouse number 2 had a greenhouse, and every square foot of available space on all 3 rooftops were filled with raised beds and contained fruits and vegetables. It was the ideal place to grow. They received several hours a day of direct sunlight, and the steady breeze trained the stems of the plants to grow thick and strong. It was also ideal from a security standpoint. The only way onto the roofs was the steel fire escape affixed to Building 2. The other buildings originally had fire escapes as well, but they were dismantled and removed after the collapse. The steel beams from them were used to create walkways from the 2 adjoining warehouses onto the roof of warehouse number 2. This made it much easier to secure, having just one way up onto the roofs. From the gym roof, John Allen watched his monitor as the drone he piloted flew up and down the streets and alleys around the warehouse buildings. He picked up his radio and keyed the mic. I am the Sky, the team leader. Copy, Chief? Kevin responded. Copy, Jay. What do you see? All clear around the perimeter, Chief. No sign of anyone else approaching the garden areas. Copy that, Jay. Keep the eyes in the air until further notice. Roger that, Chief. Jacob spoke into his radio. Team leader, no movement from Overwatch. Repeat, Overwatch reports all clear. Roger that, Overwatch, came the response from Kevin. By this time, Kevin and one of his team members were on the fire escape just below the roof entrance. Kevin looked at his man and signaled for him to lead and cut right. When he did, Kevin followed and cut left onto the roof. They each proceeded around their individual roof edges toward the greenhouse structure in the center. They converged and stopped outside the greenhouse door. Kevin peered in and saw the lone male. Approximately 16 years old and apparently unarmed, he was filling a brown paper sack with tomatoes and peppers and other vegetables. Kevin signaled his man to wait, and they each stood fast at opposite sides of the door. When the young man with the paper sack exited back onto the roof, Kevin stepped out from behind the side of the door and grabbed the young man by his shirt collar. The youth, surprised, turned quickly, with fists clenched and ready to strike. With an open hand, Kevin hit him on the side of his head, and with the other hand, pushed him down to the ground. Kevin's partner handcuffed his hands behind his back before he realized what was happening, and they led him down off the roof and over to the church basement. The foundation of the basement was made from almost a century-old granite walls, which were several feet thick. In a windowless room there, they constructed a makeshift detention area where they brought the man. Before Kevin interviewed him, he let him sit cold and alone for 3 hours. Then, Kevin, glancing at his watch, announced, "Okay, he should be ready to talk." And he walked down the hall and into the small, dank room that housed the prisoner. Isaac Rubens and John Allen watched on the monitor from in a large room at the bottom of the stairs as Kevin began to ask the young man questions. The young man was visibly shaken. He was trembling from the cold, and asked Kevin several times for a blanket or a sweatshirt. Kevin ignored his pleas and just kept asking him question after question. Where did you come from? Who are you working with? Where is your group? How many are there? The young man, shaken to the point of tears, just kept shrugging and saying he was alone, that he had nobody waiting, no group. Kevin just kept asking the questions over and over again. Pastor and John watched from the observation room. Pastor told John that he had seen enough. I'm putting a stop to this. He's just a kid, Pastor insisted. John looked at his friend and said, Isaac, let Kevin do his job. He knows how to handle this. He's not hurting that young man, and I don't need to remind you he was caught stealing food. Pastor just looked at John and nodded. Kevin looked up at the camera in the corner of the room. He shrugged and turned to walk out the door, heading back down the hall to the room where Pastor and John were waiting.